Record. Okay, so, and it's the wrong date, but it's June 4th. I'm lagging a little bit today. So we're going to talk about some evidence-based strategies for reducing those equity gaps that we've always seen in our classes, but they've become a little bit worse in the last few years, especially since the pandemic. If you'd like a copy of the slides, you can either type in this URL or you can aim your phone at that little dinosaur up there, the Google dinosaur, and get a copy of it. And it will ask you to make a copy. It's not really putting in any type of a virus, as far as I know, on your computers. And then you get your own copy. So if you want to add some notes to it or use them or do whatever you want with them, you can do that. Okay, so does everyone have a copy? Or at least get the link?
I think.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so then, let's briefly talk about the equity gaps we observe. The most common things we see are tied to race and ethnicity, those students who are from traditionally minoritized groups. We often see equity gaps tied to gender in STEM fields, less so now than in the past, but we see a lot tied to income, often measured in studies as Pell eligibility status, and also first-gen students who haven't had the same sort of support and structure as students from continuing generation families. And here's just a little bit of the breakdown from the last census, showing the difference in graduation within 150% of program time by race at four-year colleges. And you notice that Asian students have a 77% probability from the time they graduate, from the time they enter to graduating 6 years later. But Black individuals only have a 42%, so there's a really dramatic difference there. White individuals are or non-resident individuals are, and white individuals do a little bit better with et cetera, but it drops down particularly for Black and Hispanic or for people from mixed races and so on. And this this effect is larger for males. We didn't pick a breakdown for all of these. We could spend the whole day talking about the different gaps, but they're very real and they're very significant. But there's also been a tremendous amount of research on studying what things we can do to try to reduce some of these. And many of these I know we're trying to do. Some of them we could probably do a bit more. One of the first things we can do is building more of a sense of community and belongingness. When students feel that they belong at the institution, when they feel connected to it, they're much more likely to continue on to graduation. Those personal connections matter. We did a reading group a few years back on relationship-rich education, which summarizes a lot of the research on this. And some basic strategies in terms of classroom instruction, which is what this session is focused on. One of the simplest things, well, let me rephrase that. One of the most effective and in theory simplest things is to learn the names of your students. And I say that in theory, it's really easy. In practice, some of us aren't that good at it, particularly as we age. It becomes a little harder to remember names, like Debbie over there, or sorry. In any case, or when you have a really large class, it's often difficult to remember students' names. But the effort put into learning students' names and using those names makes a significant difference in student feeling part of the class group and in student success and so on. Another simple thing that can be done is just arriving early to class and staying a little bit later, arriving earlier and just chatting with students a little bit, not always just the students in the front, but wander through the class a little bit, ask students how they're doing and so on. And staying late because there's often students, especially in larger classes, sorry, who sometimes feel uncomfortable asking questions in the class, but they're much more comfortable coming up and talking to you after the class. So making sure you're not rushing out the door as soon as you finish your class can really help build a little bit more sense of community and connection. Wander around during activities. Teaching by walking around is a phrase that is really, that's often used for this. So if students are working on something or they're working on group work or even just trying to solve a problem or whatever, wander around and talk to them. a couple of years ago, I had my leg run over and I couldn't walk up and down in Lanigan 101. I was using a walker for a bit. And it was really frustrating because one thing I noticed is the students in the back just seemed more and more disconnected. And normally I'd go back there while they were working on problems and I'd be chatting with them and they were just so much more engaged. And it was so frustrating not being able to move up and down. By the end of the semester, I was able to go up at least a couple of tiers. And the next year I was able to walk around more, and it was so much more effective than just kind of being pinned to leaning against the podium so my legs wouldn't collapse, which was not the most pleasant of times. But that ability to wander around and talk to students really makes them much more likely to come in and talk to you if they're having problems. Don't just stay up on a podium going through slides and lecturing, as kind of I'm talking about here. But in class, it's really effective to go around and work with them. Another really useful strategy, and this has come up in all the reading groups we've done on inclusive teaching, is to try to connect as effectively as you can to student interest and try to use examples that are relevant to the students. A simple thing you can do is use something like the Who's in Class forum that Tracy Addy, along with Derek Dubé and Khadijah Mitchell have developed, which is available online, and I think it's in the resources we'll share at the end, to collect information on your students, information about their composition, some demographic information, and also interests on their career goals, their hobbies, their likes, things that they're particularly interested in. And to the extent to which we can tie what we're doing to the interests of the individual students in our class, the more likely it is that they'll be engaged. And if you can specifically refer to people's hobbies or sports or other things, that's not a bad thing either during a class. And another really useful way of doing this, we talked about this in another session, is you could use a Google form, or you could use any other form to collect information from students. And it could be anonymous, or it could be personalized, or it could have their information on it. And you could upload that into one of the AI tools without the student names, and get some suggestions on learning activities that are connected to the interests of students in your class, especially if you're giving students the option of choosing among different discussion topics, if it's an online discussion forum, or if you want to give them different assignments to work on and they get to pick the type of problem they're working on. You can have ChatGPT assist in creating relevant examples. In the reading group we did this spring on Dan Levy's book, Teaching Effective, Dan Levy and Angela Perez's book on teaching effectively with ChatGPT, one of the things he talked about was he had this example that he'd been using for years in a class, and it was getting a little bit stale because it just didn't connect to students as well as it did when he first used it 3 or 4 years earlier. So he had ChatGPT come up with some analogous case studies or situations that would address the same issue. And it came up with, one of the things he noted was examples that he would never have come up with in 1,000 years if it was just him sitting there trying to think up examples. And again, you can use information on students' interests to feed into that to help create customized examples that align with the interests of the students in your particular class. And also regularly remind students how you're available to assist them. Let them know what your office hours are, let them know when else they can reach you, whether you're available over Zoom, and also let them know when you're not available, so that if a student writes an email to you at 2 in the morning, they shouldn't expect an email by 2:30 in the morning, although sometimes they get those anyway. And if you're not going to be responding to email over the weekend, make that explicit. Let students know so they're not getting disappointed and not hearing back from you. If you have some boundaries on the times you're available, make students aware of that so that they're not expecting something that they're not going to get. And students generally respect that as long as they're told in advance. But do respond as quickly as you can. Okay. And there have been 2 studies that were really remarkable in terms of the small size of intervention and the effect that they generated. One was a study by Elizabeth Canning, Makita White, and I think it was Peter Davis. I don't remember Davis's first name, but in any case, They had two individualized with students' names, growth mindset emails in a large chemistry class after each of the first two graded assessments. And it went to the students talking about the grades and how they did, and also reminding them that it can be helpful, or that it's a normal part of learning to not do as well as you might expect. And that's perfectly normal, but also provide them with some information about how with work they'll be able to, this will seem much easier for them as they continue to develop over the course of the semester, and remind them that you're there to support them. What they found was that all students, when they got that message in this was a randomized controlled trial, the students who got this message ended up being more likely to persist. They ended up with higher grades and so forth. And it made a significant difference. The interesting thing is they had tried this a year before with just one message. One message wasn't enough. It took two messages to have that sort of impact. Perhaps the first message they got and figured, well, I'll do better next time. But if they didn't do well in the first two graded assessments, the message seemed a little bit more relevant, perhaps, and they took it to heart. And growth mindset messages, reminding students that these are skills that they can become better at, and you have confidence in them, and et cetera, in their ability to be successful in the course, and you're there to support them, can be really, really effective. And that was a very large and significant effect. Another study by Carell and Kurlander, which came out in 2023 in large economics classes, they sent, again, two personalized messages, but they were looking at basically the effect of race. And what they found, that by sending out two messages to students who were struggling in the class, again, after the first two graded assessments, reminding the students that the instructor is available to help them, and reminding them of their office hours and so forth. And that year was 2020. It wasn't 2023. That was an error in the slide. Sorry about that. We interviewed them in 2023 on the podcast. The study was actually 2020. But what they found was, not only did this reduce the improve all students, but it reduced the racial equity gap. In fact, it cut it by more than half. So the difference between Black and white student performance in the group was half as large in the group that was exposed to these two personalized messages that went to all the students who were doing less well in the class, basically. And they also followed this up 4 years later, and they found that students' GPAs who received this message in just one course on two graded assessments had significantly higher retention and significantly higher grades. So persistence increased and GPAs increased consistently over the 4-year period, not just in the semester and in the course where this existed. So just that sort of messages. And the title of the paper, by the way, was "My Professor Cares," just reminding them that you care about their success and you're there to help them, made a remarkably large difference. Michelle.
John, were those just sent to students that that did not do well in the first, or was it sent to everybody?
My recollection is, in this study, I think it went, I did say it went to the students who did not do well, but it went to everybody, I believe.
Okay, I was just curious.
But in that particular study, it also listed the grade. So it said your grade on this was this, and I think it was customized a bit depending on how they did. If they didn't do very well, it reminded them that it's normal to struggle and so forth. And I think they got a different message if they did well. I don't remember the details on that. But I'm pretty sure this went out to everyone in this group. Again, this was a randomized controlled experiment. So some people got the growth mindset messaging and others got a more neutral type of message that just listed the grade. So just by including this notion that it's normal to struggle and that with, you have the capability to be successful, et cetera, that's what made the difference, that the growth mindset aspect of it reduced that.
Does Starfish still have that capability?
Yes.
Do people still use it?
Well, it has the ability to do kudos, and it has as far as I know, it's still in use. I certainly used it a lot in the fall. In the spring, I was teaching mostly seniors, and they were all doing pretty well. Yeah. So
Okay, just, I
But
remember we used to be able to do that, use a formula to figure out who to
yes,
send
that
which
broke down
message.
for a little bit, but I believe it's working again.
Great.
In particular, it wasn't working in the fall when I tried doing it, and I had to do it by hand, and that was just a real big pain with 260 or whatever students. But yeah, tying it, automating it to the gradebook thresholds is good. But you can also do this in Brightspace. In fact, in the last workshop, we talked about how to do this, where you could have personalized messages to students tied to the grades on any individual graded assessment that mentions their name in it. So it could be hi and then the first name, and it said, I see you struggled a little bit on this exam, and that's really normal. It's just part of the learning process, and et cetera. So you can build that in directly in Brightspace, and it's really easy to do. And once you do it on one assessment, you just copy it over and change the assessments and change your wording a little bit, so they're not all getting something that seems as automatic. And I suspect that may not be quite as good as the one where it specifically mentions the exact grade, but at least can say that, your grade in this class is a bit lower than we would have hoped, but, that's common. It's not abnormal. And, with work and effort and using these supportive materials a little bit more effectively, you can be more, you can continue to become more successful in this class. So there's a lot that still can be done. I like the fact that they were able to send the grades to them in an email after the first two assessments. We don't have that same ability in Brightspace yet. We did have that back in Angel. We lost it when we moved to Blackboard, and we don't yet have it back in Brightspace. So, but in any case, we can still send it for people in any grade category you want. You could set it on grades below a 50%, grades between 60 and 65, 70 and 80, et cetera, or grades above a 90, you can do it. And it's really easy to so those sort of messages can make a difference. It's also really helpful in terms of building community, to build student-to-student connections, get students to know each other. Even in the large class, what I do on the first day is I tell students to introduce themselves to the students around them, because students always tend to sit in the same seats in the large class. It's amazing how little mobility there is from one seat to another over the course of the semester. I said, these are students you're going to be working with throughout the class. We're going to be doing a lot of work. You'll be doing, you'll be doing some work with clicker problems and so forth, and you'll be working with the people immediately around you. So get to know them, introduce yourself, talk about your majors, what your hobbies are, and so forth. And that tends to help increase even something as simple as that can help increase student interactions. But also doing as much as you can with cooperative and team-based learning activities can be helpful. If you're doing persistent activities, you may want to think about whether you're going to sort students randomly or with a neutral criteria. One thing I generally don't recommend is letting students pick their own groups unless it's based on the topic area that they're going to be working on, because especially in upper level classes, and I've had this happen many times, where in my capstone course, the students who are in there often have taken multiple classes with each other, specifically when it's a math econ major. They've been taking classes with the same people often for 4 years, and they get to know each other, except for those students who transferred in, or for those students who may be taking it who is an economics major and haven't taken as many math or stat classes. And when I'm creating teams there, I want them to be as balanced as I can. And specifically, when they're doing work with empirical studies, where they're working with, regression, probit analysis, loaded analysis, sample selection models, it's really helpful if students who are in groups are mixed, so that there are some students who have taken more stat classes and more math classes, and also a mix of students who haven't had the same background. Because otherwise what happens is you tend to get the student automatically picking their friends who've been successful and done well and taken a lot of math classes all in one group. And you get the students with a lesser background or a weaker background, or let me rephrase that, you get students who haven't taken as many courses and don't have the same level of preparation in statistics, for example, in other groups. And to keep it balanced, one of the things I do in that specific class is I just ask them on a simple Google form to put in their name and to list how many math classes they've taken, or math and statistics classes, because some of them will take it in psych or in other departments. And then I just sort it from highest to low. And if there's going to be 8 groups in the class, I just go through and go 1 through 8 and then keep repeating that and then sort the spreadsheet. So each group will have some people who've taken a lot of courses. Each group will have one person perhaps who hasn't had as many. And then each group will have 1 or 2 people from somewhere in the middle, just to try to keep it as balanced as possible. Or you could just randomly sort people into groups. The only qualification I would say about that is there have been some studies that in groups, this was done, specifically a study done at the Mormon Institution in Brigham Young.
Yeah,
There was a study done in the MBA program at Brigham Young where people are working in groups through all of their courses throughout the whole year. And what they found was that when students were surveyed about the contribution of people in the groups, they found that in groups where there was a majority male population, female students were rated lower in terms of the amount of participation, and also they were observed and tracked in terms of how much they actually participated in discussions. And females were both rated lower and also participated less in those discussions, where in terms of the quality of their participation in terms of rated by the group members, in groups that were male dominated than in female majority groups. And so one of the suggestions of that particular study was that perhaps you might want to make sure that if there are people who may be subject to some form of implicit bias and so forth, it may be better to create some groups that are majority female, for example. And in those cases, because the interesting thing is that males did not suffer, did their evaluation, self-evaluation, or the group evaluation of their contribution was the same regardless of what was a male dominant or female dominant group in terms of majority group. But females did seem to contribute a little bit less and were perceived as contributing less, both by themselves and others, when they were in the minority in a group. It would be nice if that would go away, but it may be a factor you may want to take into account. Because if someone doesn't feel they belong in some sense, and again, that's going to vary probably by discipline, but in disciplines where females may be more likely to be subject to stereotype threat, it may be better to have a larger proportion of females in the group, because in those cases, males are not harmed in terms of the evaluations, but females tended to benefit in at least that one study. I haven't seen any others since then. But again, providing students, this is a UDL principle, with multiple means of action and expression. You know, if you're going to have students summarize their learning or do some type of a final project in the class, it doesn't have to be a research paper. It doesn't have to be a term paper. It could be a video. It could be a podcast. It could be infographics. It could be a board game, you know, if that's feasible within your course. Because one of the things that may happen is students who may not be as strong in terms of their writing skills might be really effective at creating videos, for example, or documentary videos or something similar, if that's appropriate in your discipline. Doing peer instruction is really helpful, building in support from peers. Some of that could be with cooperative groups, but you can also do things like using clicker questions and so forth, where Eric Mazur pioneered this technique by accident, actually, and it's been used pretty successfully now for 22 years, and pretty much by everyone who's using clickers, where he'll try to come up with questions that are challenging, where about half of the students will get to the correct answer on their own, roughly half won't, plus or minus 20% or so, and then he'll ask the question once where students answer it individually. It's hard to get them to not talk in the first stage in larger classes, but ask them to think about it themselves, to reveal their answer, and then to talk to the people around them, try to find someone with a different answer and convince that the people with other answers that your answer is better, and listen to their answers and let them try to convince you that their answer was better, and then poll them again. That type of peer instruction has been shown to be remarkably effective in STEM fields. There was semi-random or a natural experiment type of setup in both in physics and in chemistry, where they measured students' knowledge of a subject before and after the course module on this, and they found that the learning gains using this methodology with peer instruction and peer debate over these things resulted in a doubling of learning gains in chemistry classes and a tripling of the gains in performance on that one course module on a standardized measure of achievement in those courses. And that was done by Eric Mazur, and Paul Wyman was the organizer of the experiment in the chemistry field. So it can be really effective when students are explaining things to each other, the same sort of way that peer tutoring works. When students are hearing things from other people with a similar level of knowledge who've just recently acquired the information, it's often much more effective than hearing it from the instructor. Plus, you've got and when they're trying to explain it to other students, they deepen and solidify their own understanding. Because if you're trying to explain something to someone who doesn't get it, it forces you to understand it and to be able to explain things much more fully, and you're much more likely to remember things. There have been a number of studies done where undergraduate and graduate TAs were used in classes, and they measured their knowledge using a standardized instrument before and after the class for students and for the TAs. And what those studies, in at least 2 cases, have found is that the largest gains in learning were for the undergraduate TAs, that the undergraduate TAs improved their understanding in the science. These were both in STEM fields, in the discipline more than the students did, and certainly more than the graduate students did. But the other thing was that the undergraduate students who worked in sections with undergraduate TAs had a larger increase in the scores than the students who worked with graduate TAs, because again, they were more effective at explaining it to students in terms that were consistent with the level of students developing understanding of the subject. So the more you can leverage peers and have them talk to each other, including perhaps peer tutors, but just leveraging the knowledge in the room and having students explain it to each other can be really effective. And again, encouraging students to get to know each other, and icebreaker activities can be useful for that and so forth. And when you do discussions, there's always going to be some students who aren't very willing to participate in a discussion in class. It's less of an issue in online classes, but there are always some students who are reluctant, especially in larger classes. And there are always some students who want to talk all the time and who are always jumping up and down wanting to answer questions. And there's a lot of things you can do to try to spread that out. You could randomly call on students if you're soliciting responses. In small groups you could have these pass the baton type things or whatever, where only the person with it can speak, or you could set up rules where no one can respond to something unless everyone has already given a response on something else, etc. But giving people multiple ways to participate is helpful. And another thing is that if students are really not that comfortable responding to a question in class or in a discussion, you can always have them do a think, pair, share type of thing and have them respond for the group, because it's much easier to talk about the group consensus than it is your own views, because students are worried about revealing that especially when they're starting a class, they're concerned that they don't want to show that they don't understand something. So giving them the option of reporting for the group is helpful, because it's not just their response they're giving, etc. Small groups are helpful. And again, in a large class, just asking questions for a group of 300 students individually isn't that helpful, but polling can be helpful, because then you can get responses from everybody. And if you are using small group activities, let students report and rotate who's going to play the role of reporting the results, who's going to record the group discussions, and so on. And make sure that the participation is balanced in some way. Okay. In general, we want to use inclusive examples. Don't just use examples that tie to your role, your past as an instructor. Use examples that will connect to students. And again, generative AI tools can be helpful in suggesting a wider variety of examples. you should avoid things that generate stereotype threat. One thing that was popular about 8 or 9 years ago was an equity walk, where you would have everyone in class stand on some sort of line in a gym or outside and ask everyone whose parents had a college degree to take a step forward, or everyone whose parents did not complete high school to take a step backwards and do similar things, or everyone whose family has 2 cars, or who has, etc. And the goal of these things, these equity walks, was to show how significant inequality was, but it also tended to promote stereotype threat and all the things we want to avoid. We want to create courses that are inclusive, that are not trying to build larger divisions among our students. So the reason I mention this is we've had people periodically suggest those are good things to show about inequality, but it can do more damage than the message that it's trying to convey. Decolonizing your readings, your curriculum can be helpful in disciplines where you can find a more diverse set of readings. Even if the traditional canon is pretty much established, there's often people who will be writing counter narratives, and you can also bring those in to provide some balance. Try to get as many voices in your class as you can to reflect the diversity of human experience, and not just the traditional canon that's been around for a century or more. And a simple thing to do to try to find alternative voices is to type in to Google something like decolonize an introductory economics course, or an introductory history class, or whatever, or decolonize your mathematics curriculum. And it will come up with some suggestions for readings or alternative books that might provide a wider range of perspectives. And, again, sometimes you will find that there's not a lot in literature. There's not a lot of literature on some topics. One of the things that often comes up is when we're talking about gender and gender preferences and so forth, and the variety of human relationships, you won't find a lot of authors writing about gay experiences or lesbian experiences, say, a century or more ago, or in 20th century American literature. You will find very few examples of that. And what the people who've done the most research in this have suggested is, when we don't have a very diverse literature in some field, one thing we can always do to help students see a connection to the material that they're learning, whatever that material is ask students to bring in their own experiences. Instead of having them read about someone's experience and in terms of how it illustrates some concept you're talking about in class, let students reflect on this and ask how they've observed this in their own lives. And by doing that, they're automatically finding connections that are relevant to them, which is what we really hope to do. We want students to be able to see that what they're learning has some relevance in their life and can explain things that perhaps couldn't be explained as well without that sort of connection. And to do that, having them make their own connections is a really helpful way of doing that. As a simple example, that one of the things I did in my large class when we did a section on behavioral economics, which talked about ways in which people behave in a manner different than what traditional economic theory suggests, issues like sunk costs and, well, a whole series of logical fallacies, not logical fallacies, but behavioral economic issues where people behave in a way that's not in their long run interests, things like procrastination, et cetera. And one of the things I asked them to do is just to write about some example where they've observed that, either in their own lives or they've observed that in the people that they generally interact with and so forth. And they found that really illuminating. It helped them understand the concept so much better. We've already mentioned growth mindset in terms of growth mindset messaging, but reminding students that struggle is part of learning. Failing is part of learning. Making mistakes is part of learning. That's how science has progressed. We try things, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but that's not how our students have been trained. They've been trained from the time they entered the school system that the only measure of success is whether they get things right on graded assessments. Reminding them that it's normal to make mistakes and you can learn from those mistakes. And I think we've talked about that enough, and everyone here, I think, is familiar enough with growth mindset that we can move on. But one suggestion is to normalize learning from mistakes. And one phrase that's used is to fail forward. I forget who used that term first. Jessamine Newhouse always talked about that. And one thing you could do is provide relevant self-disclosure about past academic struggles. If you had some issue where you struggled and then you overcame it, mention that to students. Let them know that, this is something that we all go through at times, and it makes it a lot easier for them to see that their own struggles can be overcome. And again, it's growth mindset messaging is only really important if they really do have the opportunity to make mistakes and learn from them. If we have high stakes assessments where half the grade is determined by one exam, that's not going to really be consistent with the growth mindset. So doing as much as you can with formative assessments, with low stakes or no stakes assessments, is helpful. No stakes assessments in theory are good. In practice, they don't work quite as well. There was a quote that was often used by the person who did the it was a course redesign program. The national, what was it? The National Center for Academic Transformation, Carol Twigg. One of her favorite phrases, which she used over and over again, was freshmen do not do optional. If you do give students some no stakes assessments that they can use to practice and develop their understanding, some students will do that. But generally the students who do that are the students who are already concerned about whether they get to keep their A in the class. The students who are struggling tend not to do extra work because it's a bit of a struggle. And if you just put a remarkably tiny grade on it, if something is worth 10 out of 5,000 points or 10,000 points in your class, students will do it. But if it doesn't count towards a grade, they often won't do it. So, we can rely on the lack of quantitative literacy for many students and for people in general, so that they will do things that have only a trivial direct effect on the grade, but have a fairly substantial indirect effect, because by doing these practice problems, they can do better with it. They can learn from it. And provide, when possible, opportunities to revision so that students can do things over and over again. Angela Bauer, who is the chair of the chemistry department, I believe, at Green Bay. She worked with Scott there. She was on a podcast a while back. And then at High Point, she did a couple of studies, one at Green Bay, and again, one in High Point. And the High Point one was fairly interesting. She provided a series of slides for everyone teaching introductory chemistry classes that were shared, where it was just one slide a week that had some type of a growth mindset message of someone who tried something, who struggled, and then eventually were successful, and so forth, with just different people, a diverse mix of examples. And she found that eliminated the racial and the first gen achievement, the equity gaps tied to race and to first gen status. And that's a pretty remarkable result. Usually the effects are not that large, but many of the effects will cut these things in half. And again, that study by Canning, White, and Davis I mentioned before significantly reduced the racial gap. In fact, I believe it cut it in half again in that case. Another interesting study by Elizabeth Canning and a few other people was that faculty mindset is as important. There was a study done, I believe it was at Harvard. I'm not positive on where it was done, but my recollection was, well, wherever it was done, they gave faculty in STEM fields a survey of their mindset to establish to what extent they had a growth mindset. And what they found was that faculty who had a growth mindset had students that on average performed better, but also they found that those equity gaps were significantly smaller for faculty who believe that students can become more proficient at things by working at it. Those faculty who had a fixed mindset, who believed that either people were good at math or were not good at math, ended up having a much, on average, lower performance for all students, but also much larger equity gap, so that the racial gap, the income gap, and the first gen gap, and the gender gap in those cases in STEM fields was significantly larger if faculty did not believe that students could become more proficient by working on things. So, and in fact, they also surveyed student mindset, and they found that the mindset of the instructor, whether the instructors believe that students could be successful, had more of an impact on student performance than the student's own mindset. So encouraging growth mindset is really good for students, but if faculty don't believe it, it can do a tremendous amount of harm and build much greater equity gaps. And there are studies that go back. The retrieval practice, studies on that go back for over a century. It was called the testing effect originally, but basically, the more the students practice retrieving information, the more deeply they learn things. And that the most important thing is just practicing recalling information. And that's the opposite of what most students do. What most students will do is they'll practice storing information, that they will read something over repeatedly. They will keep reading something, they'll highlight it, and they'll practice going through the things. And what studies have shown, both in controlled experiments and as well as in some classroom testing, is that rereading something once within a week or two can increase the amount that you recall. However, a second or third reading or fourth reading has no significant effect on the amount that students will recall. And students tend to read things repeatedly right before an exam. And the effect of that is they're wasting a tremendous amount of time. And it would be really helpful if we could get students to practice retrieving information rather than trying to store it. The way our brains work is our brains are training themselves basically to remember things that we've convinced the brain that it's important. And the way you train a brain to believe that something is important is by practicing trying to retrieve it. The more you practice trying to recall some information, the more you will remember it. And that has a very dramatic effect on long-term recall and also on the ability to transfer that information, to take the concepts that you've learned and apply them in new circumstances and new conditions, which is something that students struggle with. Cramming, which is the most common practice, will give you a slight boost in what you recall within the next few hours, but the amount that you remember a week later is virtually nothing. But if you practice retrieving things, you'll remember things much longer. It slows the rate of forgetting. And again, there's studies for over a century that emphasize this, yet our students virtually never do this. And the way our courses are designed often tend to discourage this because we use high stakes exams where all that matters is how they do on the exam and not how much of it they've actually learned. The next thing there is space practice, which again has been known for at least 50 or 60 years. And that is that spacing practice sessions is really important. Spending a long block of time trying to study something is very ineffective in terms of your ability to recall it. The more you space your study sessions, the better off you are. Spending 3 hours once a week studying something is far less effective than spending a half an hour 6 days a week trying to study the same material. You'll remember far more. So spacing it out is really important. The next thing, it's often tied to the space practice in the way courses are designed. It's interleave practice, and that's by mixing up the practice sessions. So you're not just studying one thing at a time. Well, the classic example of that might help illustrate that. The one example was a study that was done where students were taught how to measure the volume of 4 different geometric objects, where they were given the formulas and so forth and showed how to compute it. And in one case, they watched 4 videos, each one about 10 minutes explaining how to do it. And then they were tested on a random mix of questions from any of those 4 things. In the other case, they watched a video, they answered questions on it. They watched the next video, they answered questions on it, etc. And the first example is interleave practice. The other thing where they watch something and they practice it, and they watch something else and they practice that, is called block practice, where you just practice one thing, then you move on to the next, and then you leave the rest behind. What they found is that when students had interleave practice, they did less well on the test for that collection of 40 questions, let's say. However, when they were retested a week later, their scores actually went up. And the students who had the block practice had scores that were not significantly different than random guessing. It was a multiple choice type test. And so what that suggests is that the way in which most of our classes are designed and most of our textbooks are designed is not very effective for learning. For example, in math, you learn one skill, you practice it, you're tested on it, then you move on to a new topic. And that's true in many disciplines. And unless you come back and you keep going back and using those skills again, in many classes you do that, it's not as effective as if you work with a mix of these things. It was an interesting story when we did a reading group on Make It Stick, where in Washington, the Washington lab, where the authors of this book are, one of the authors joined us, and he talked about an example of interleave practice involving one member of the group. And I won't mention which one's name, but he said one of the members of the group was playing in this adult hockey league. And he was troubled because he said, when I first played hockey, we'd work on a skill, we'd work on it until we mastered it, then we move on to another skill. He said, this guy gives us a little bit of an introduction on each of these, and then he makes us work through it in game-like situations, and that he keeps making us switch up from doing one thing to another. And the other two authors looked at him and said, that's interleave practice. That's one of the things we're trying to encourage people to do. Another simple study that was done of that type of thing was to have people try to throw a ball into a wastebasket, where in one case it was 10 feet away, another it was 20, and et cetera. And they had people do that, and they found that after they did a few throws into it, they got pretty good at it. And then once they moved to another distance, they were fairly good at that. But in the other case, they just kept moving that basket every single time they threw the ball in it. And what they found was that people were not very good immediately when the distance kept changing. But when they then tried to do it later with different distances, the people who had the interleave practice, trying it at different distances without repeatedly trying to do the same thing over and over again, were much better at trying to throw it in at whatever distance happened to be selected. Again, interleave practice does help. And, what most researchers suggest is that maybe you do want to do some block practice first. You need to master some of the basics of a skill, but the sooner you can move into interleave practice, the better. Going back to the volume of those geometric shapes, one of the issues was that it's one thing just to be able to plug numbers into a formula that you have in your short-term memory. It's another thing where you have to not only plug numbers into a formula, but you have to recall which formula applies in each case. And that just creates a little bit more cognitive processing. And it's one of those things that is referred to as by Bjork and Bjork, is referred to as a desirable difficulty. The more cognitive effort you put into a task, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to become proficient at that task. The more likely you are to remember it. So interleave practice is really good, and it's not always built into our classes as much as you can. Although if you do have, one way of implementing this in class is by having a series of progressively cumulative exams, for example, where students may work on a skill at first, they add a new skill, but then you test them on a mix of the old and the new materials regularly as you move through. I've restructured my introductory class to do that. So as they move through the first module, they only have questions from the first module. The second, they mostly have questions from the second module, but the 10% or so comes from the first. And then progressively, more and more of that material gets randomly added as they move through each week of the course. And doing that thing can be helpful in building long-term recall. And there's also a lot of evidence that having students reflect on their learning helps improve their learning. Thinking about what they've learned, what skills they're struggling with, and so forth, can help remove some of the illusions that people may have about what they know. And these methods, adaptive learning, personalized learning, mastery learning systems, all build some of that in. We're running a little short on time because I'm talking too much. Sorry. Another thing that matters is resource scarcity. When students are hungry, when they don't know what's happening, whether they don't know what their immigration status will be, or whether, someone's going to come and arrest them in the middle of the night or pull them off the street, that can be harmful. That, when students are going through stress and so forth, it can be harmful, et cetera. Stress, well, there's the stress part. Another simple thing is when students face delays in getting the textbooks or other materials, or if they hesitate to do it, even if they do have financial aid that will let them do it, many students will wait a bit if they're struggling to meet their bills and so on. And it's really helpful if we all use either OER textbooks that are free, or at least if inclusive access is used, so all students get first day access and start their courses at an equal footing. And we should all, the college has been encouraging this, provide students in our syllabi and in Brightspace to provide students with information on services for mental health, food insecurity, and other support. Okay, we're running out of time. We just did a workshop on structure. No, this is a workshop. Providing, we talked about it in the last session, so they're kind of blending together, but having more structure in your courses puts all students on a more equal footing. Providing students with if students have been in a school where only 5% of them or 3% of them go on to college, they're going to have a very different preparation than a school where 80% or 90% of students are going on to college. They won't have had the same sort of practice with college writing assignments, with essays and other things. And providing more structure, more detail on what's expected, taking complex tasks and breaking it up into a series of components, so that instead of having a term paper that's due at the end of the term and you provide students very little information along the way, or a paper that's due in a month, you can scaffold it. You can ask students to turn in an overview of it, then perhaps a bibliography, then perhaps an annotated bibliography, perhaps then in outline or detailed outline and so forth. And by doing it that way, it reduces the anxiety, reduces the stakes, and you can provide students with feedback. So instead of students going off in a bad direction or an unproductive direction early, you can help nudge them or help assist them in finding a more productive path to success. So the more you can do with scaffolding is helpful, the more feedback you can give students at each stage. And again, take complex tasks and break them up into small steps, because we all procrastinate. If we have a series of deadlines for something that each involve a small step, it's much more likely that students will get everything done and at a higher quality than if we don't do that. Providing clear and complete instructions. And that's another thing where generative AI can be useful. Ask a generative AI system to evaluate the instructions and suggest improvements in those. And it does a pretty good job with that. Providing exemplars of high quality work and maybe some lower quality work. Ken Bain does this experiment, or used to use this thing in his writing class, where he gave students an example of an A paper, a B paper, and a C paper without assigning a grade. He sent them into groups and had them determine which grades were an A paper, which were a B paper, and which were a C paper. And then he had them determine why. What was the difference between an A paper and a B paper and a B paper and a C paper? And they came up with criteria that were then used to develop a class rubric, which was then shared with everyone. And when students came up with those criteria themselves, they were it's much easier to see those sort of things in papers that you haven't written than in your own work. But once they've seen it, it makes it easier for them to help meet those criteria. And the tilt approach is something we've been talking about in probably 90% of the workshops now, and it's especially important in the world of AI, which is basically making clear what you expect from students, why they're doing certain work, and how they're going to be evaluated on it. Active learning in pretty much all studies have been really helpful, but the interesting thing is that the gains from active learning are larger. Active learning benefits everyone in terms of grades, in terms of persistence, in terms of learning and long-term recall, but the gains are largest for first-gen students, Pell-eligible students, and students from historically minoritized groups. In a study done with the Active Learning Initiative at Cornell, a couple of economists analyzed the data, and they found that the racial equity gap completely disappeared when they introduced active learning activities in their economics courses. And it made a huge difference in general across the board. And it also eliminated most of the income gap and so forth in performance. One concern for instructors trying to do this is that students do not like active learning, because if you're sitting there listening to an instructor ramble on for an hour, kind of like I've been doing, but in general, it's really easy to think that you've understood it all. But the times when you have trouble is when you try to apply it. And so what happens is with active learning, it's revealed to students when they don't fully understand something in class. And that doesn't seem as good. It seems like their instructor didn't teach them quite as well. So when students are surveyed, they find that classes that are lecture-based are preferred in general. They think they learn more with lecture-based classes. However, when it's done in randomized controlled experiments or with natural experiments, the students who are in classes with active learning end up on standard metric doing better in terms of their performance when they're taking the same assessments and so forth. So students learn more with active learning, but they don't feel that way. And the comments generally instructors get are, I thought you were going to teach me more. You're making me learn it all this by myself, or I have to learn this stuff on my own. And, we can't really do the learning for students, but the more students interact with the material, the more they learn. So selling students on this and reminding them of the research and why you're doing this is really important. And that's especially true if you're an instructor in a group who may tend to be penalized based on race, gender, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of other things here, but you've all got this shared. There we go. Here's some resources, which links to some of the studies on each of these topics. And we're pretty much out of time because we got another workshop in less than 4 minutes. So any quick questions or thoughts? This is too much to do in 1 hour, especially if I wanted to make it more interactive. Okay, well, thank you. Good seeing everybody, and we'll be back.
Thank you.